Nintendo finally did it! Ocarina of Time remake is real! We've seen the teaser, we've seen the updated graphics, and that's about it. Seriously! Nintendo somehow managed to announce one of the most anticipated remakes in gaming history, while telling us almost nothing! So while we wait for more information, I thought it'd be fun to talk about what I'd like to see from the remake. Some of these ideas are probably realistic. Some of them definitely aren't. And a few of them are likely to get me assassinated by Nintendo ninjas. Because now that the remake is happening, the question isn't whether Nintendo is making one. The question is how much they're willing to change. Let's get into it. Before we start talking about what I'd like to see in an Ocarina of Time remake, I think we need to answer a simple question. What do we even mean by remake? Because not all remakes are created equal. When some people hear Ocarina of Time remake, they're picturing the exact same game with modern graphics and a few quality of life improvements. Others are imagining new dungeons, expanded storylines, and entirely new areas to explore. And some fans are hoping for a complete reimagining that takes the original game and rebuilds it from the ground up. Personally, I think there are three directions Nintendo could take with the remake. The first is a simple remake. The same game at its core, but enhanced with modern visuals, quality of life improvements, and perhaps a few small additions. The second is a larger remake. The core adventure remains intact, but Nintendo expands it with new content, new ideas, and more things to do. And the third is what I'd call the grand remake. The version that isn't afraid to make major changes. Redesign content, rework systems, and push Ocarina of Time into an entirely new direction. Now, technically, we've already seen something close to the simple remake with Ocarina of Time 3D. It modernized the visuals, improved the interface, added quality of life features, and introduced the game to a new generation of players. And overall, it was pretty good. But it was also a very conservative remake. Now that Nintendo is remaking Ocarina of Time again, I think most fans are expecting something a little bigger. Let's start with the simple remake anyway, because honestly, I think that's still the most likely scenario. Based on the teaser, a simple remake actually looks like the most likely outcome right now. And if the recent Star Fox 64 remake taught us anything, it's that even a simple remake can still bring something new to the table. The core game remained largely unchanged, but Nintendo still found ways to flesh out the story and characters, and that's exactly the kind of approach I'd love to see with Ocarina of Time. Even without changing the story itself, there are so many opportunities to expand on what's already there. Ocarina of Time has one of the most beloved stories in gaming, but it's also surprisingly brief in some places. Characters appear, play important roles, and then often disappear before we really get to know them. We've already seen what story expansion can look like in Zelda. The Ocarina of Time manga added new scenes and character moments, although it also took some pretty major liberties with the original story. A better example might be the Twilight Princess manga. It stayed largely faithful to the game while expanding characters, relationships, and emotional moments that the original simply didn't have time to explore. That's the kind of expansion I'd want from a simple remake. Not a different story, just more of the story that's already there. Give us a few more scenes with Zelda. Let us spend more time with the sages before they awaken. Show us more of Ganondorf before he becomes the king of evil. And perhaps, most importantly, show us what happens after the ending. One of the biggest mysteries in Ocarina of Time is what becomes of these characters once the adventure is over. We know bits and pieces from later games and official timelines, but there's still plenty of room to explore Link's return to childhood, Zelda's perspective after the timeline split, and the future of the friends and allies we spent the entire game saving. For a game this beloved, sometimes more isn't about changing what's there. It's about finally showing us the moments we've always wanted to see. Another topic that's bound to divide fans is voice acting. Personally, I'd like to see it, and to be fair, there was a smidge of it in the teaser. I know some fans would rather keep Ocarina of Time completely text-based. And after the mixed reactions to some of Zelda's recent voice acting, I understand why. But for a game this story-driven, I think voice acting could add a lot to the experience. Imagine hearing Ganondorf's speeches fully voiced, or seeing more emotion in conversations between Link and Zelda. That said, there is one important exception: Link. I still think Link should remain mostly silent. Not completely silent. A few simple responses here and there? Sure. Yes, no, okay. But the moment Link starts delivering long speeches, I think you lose something important. Part of what makes Link work is that the player fills in the gaps. His choices are your choices. For me, the ideal approach is simple. Voice the world around Link. But let Link remain mostly the same hero he's always been. Of course, a simple remake isn't just about story content and voice acting. It's also about presentation. And this is where things get a little more complicated. Ocarina of Time was released during an interesting period in Zelda's history. One of the things that made early Zelda so fascinating was how many different influences it blended together. Christian imagery appeared throughout the series, including crosses on shields, references to holy water, and even Christian religious text appearing in some early versions of the original games. At the same time, Zelda was heavily influenced by Eastern traditions as well, with shrines, spiritual themes, and ideas that reflected Japanese culture and mythology. Then you have the fantasy influences. Elements of the Lord of the Rings can be seen throughout the series, while Link himself was famously inspired in part by Peter Pan. The result was a world that felt unlike almost anything else in gaming. Zelda wasn't purely Western fantasy, and it wasn't purely Eastern fantasy either. It was its own unique blend of both. By the time Ocarina of Time arrived, many of those influences were still visible. The original release famously included Islamic-inspired symbols on the mirror shield and throughout the Spirit Temple. The Fire Temple's original music also contained chanting that would later be removed, part of a broader pattern of changes Nintendo would make in future versions of the game. Whether you call it censorship, localization, or modernization, Nintendo has spent decades stripping away many of the religious references that once helped shape Zelda's identity, in favor of the more strictly fantasy direction that began around the time of Ocarina of Time. And before somebody races to the comments, no, I'm not saying Zelda needs to become a religious game. That's obviously not the point. The point is that all those influences help make the series feel unique. The game also wasn't afraid to be a little darker. There are skeletons hanging from dungeon walls, piles of bones, blood effects that were changed in later releases, and entire locations like the Shadow Temple and bottom of the well that feel generally unsettling. Now, I'm realistic. Just because the remake is happening doesn't mean everything from the original is coming back unchanged. Some censorship is probably unavoidable. Do I like it? No. Do I expect it? Absolutely. But personally, the less censorship, the better. One of the reasons Ocarina of Time remains so memorable is because it wasn't afraid to feel mysterious, strange, and occasionally uncomfortable. The Shadow Temple feels disturbing. The bottom of the well feels haunted. Ganondorf feels generally dangerous. And that's a good thing. The Shadow Temple's supposed to be creepy. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. That's the entire point. Those elements gave the world weight and helped make Hyrule feel like a place worth saving. In fact, simply modernizing the graphics could make many of these moments more impactful than they ever were on the Nintendo 64. Imagine exploring the Shadow Temple with modern lighting, detailed environments, and today's technology. Locations that were already creepy could become unforgettable. Now, as much as I'd love to see what an M-rated Zelda might look like, let's be honest. With Nintendo, that's never gonna happen. If it does, feel free to come back to this video and laugh at me. But that's not really the point. I'm not asking Nintendo to make Ocarina of Time more mature. I'm asking them not to make it less mature, like they did with the 3DS remake. If preserving the original atmosphere means dealing with some darker themes, disturbing imagery, or a little blood, then that's just part of the game. Now, could a darker, more mature Zelda be interesting? Absolutely! But only if it serves the story. I'm simply asking Nintendo to preserve what was already there. Because preserving the atmosphere? Preserving the darker tone? Preserving the identity of the original game? That's not too much to ask. At the end of the day, that's what I'd want from a simple remake. Respect. Respect the story. Respect the atmosphere. Respect what made Ocarina of Time special in the first place. Because if Nintendo can't get that right, it won't matter how good the graphics look. But let's say Nintendo does get it right. Let's say they preserve the story, the atmosphere, and everything that made Ocarina of Time special. What if they decide to go further? Because that's where things start to get really interesting. A larger remake wouldn't just update Ocarina of Time, it would expand it. But before we start adding new dungeons, new quests, or new areas, we need to answer another important question. How much should Nintendo actually change? Because let's be honest, now that Nintendo is remaking Ocarina of Time, there will be enormous pressure to make it more like Breath of the Wild. A bigger world, more freedom, more exploration. And while I liked Breath of the Wild a lot, I don't think that's the direction Ocarina of Time should go. In fact, I'd be strongly against it. One of the reasons Ocarina of Time works so well is because of its balance. The game isn't completely linear, but it's not completely open either. You're given room to explore. A dungeon or two can even be completed out of order. Room to uncover secrets and side quests. But the game also knows when to point you in the right direction. The result is an adventure that feels open without ever feeling aimless. Every dungeon builds toward the next. Every major story moment arrives when it should. No offense, Tears of the Kingdom. Actually, a little offense. And because of that, the pacing remains incredibly strong from beginning to end. If you completely open the game up, I think you risk losing some of that magic. Now, that doesn't mean Nintendo can't borrow ideas from Breath of the Wild. Better exploration? Absolutely. More things to discover between locations. Sounds great. A larger Hyrule with more side activities? I'd love to see it, but at its core, Ocarina of Time should remain Ocarina of Time. The larger remake shouldn't be trying to turn Ocarina of Time into Breath of the Wild. It should be trying to become the best version of Ocarina of Time possible. I know that's a radical concept these days, and honestly, Nintendo wouldn't have to look very far for ideas. One thing many people forget is that Ocarina of Time's development was full of compromises. The game changed dramatically during development, and plenty of ideas ended up on the cutting room floor. Some ideas were cut because of time. Others disappeared as development evolved. But unlike Pokemon, I didn't get a cool new Charizard out of the deal. So if Nintendo wants to expand Ocarina of Time, I think that's the first place they should look. Not to completely reinvent the game, to finish it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every cut idea deserves to come back. Some ideas are cut for good reasons. But if Nintendo is looking for ways to expand the experience, why not start with content that was originally intended to be there? And from there, the possibilities start to open up. A larger Hyrule, more NPCs, more side quests, new items, more secrets hidden throughout the world. Maybe even entirely new races or cultures that help make Hyrule feel bigger and more alive than it did on the Nintendo 64. The world felt enormous in 1998. Today, you can practically sprint across the kingdom before finishing a chapter of Green Eggs and Ham. And that's not criticism, it's just reality. A larger remake has an opportunity to preserve that feeling of wonder while finally giving Hyrule the scale Nintendo originally dreamed of. Now, if Nintendo does borrow ideas from Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, I think they need to be very selective. For example, crafting could work surprisingly well. Not everything needs 50 crafting ingredients attached to it, Nintendo. Not the kind of crafting system where I need 10 different menus, 100 ingredients, and a spreadsheet to remember what everything does. Keep it simple. This is Ocarina of Time, not a part-time job. Maybe you can craft arrows, potions, bombs, upgrades, or a handful of useful items while exploring the world. That's enough. What I don't want is a giant inventory system with pages and pages of material to sort through. That sounds about as fun as standing around waiting for King Zora to finish his daily commute. At least then I'd eventually get somewhere. And then we get to durability. Ocarina of Time already had durability. Deku sticks break. The giant's knife breaks. Wooden shields burn. The concept isn't new. The difference is that the system knew when to get out of the player's way. Personally, I think a larger remake could expand on that idea without going overboard. If you pick up a crude wooden weapon, sure, let it break eventually. That makes sense. But if I find a rare weapon, complete a side quest, or earn some legendary piece of equipment, I don't want it shattering after a handful of fights. And if something does break, let me repair it. Most importantly, leave the Master Sword alone. No durability meter. No energy meter. No waiting 10 minutes for it to recharge. The Master Sword should feel like the Master Sword. If Nintendo wants to start it off weaker and allow players to strengthen it throughout the game, I'd be completely fine with that. But by the end of the adventure, it should be the undisputed best weapon in the game. After all, if the legendary Blade of Evil's Bane can't outperform a tree branch, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Of course, if we're talking about expansion, there's one character who should be at the top of the list: Ganondorf. The original game does a fantastic job establishing him as a threat. We see him manipulate the King of Hyrule. We witness his ambition. We watch him seize the Triforce and bring ruin to the kingdom. But after the 7-year time skip, something strange happens. For most of the game, Ganondorf becomes surprisingly passive. The man conquers Hyrule and then apparently decides to kick back upstairs and binge Netflix until the hero shows up. We're constantly told how powerful he is. We see the damage he's caused, but we rarely see him actively doing anything. And that's one area where I think a larger remake could dramatically improve the original. Give us more scenes with Ganondorf. Show us more of his rule over Hyrule. Let us see how his actions affect ordinary people throughout the kingdom. And don't just lock him away inside Ganon's castle waiting for the final battle. Let him feel like a living threat. Maybe his forces launch attacks on settlements. Maybe certain regions become more dangerous as his influence spreads. Maybe the world itself changes as Ganondorf tightens his grip on Hyrule. Because if Nintendo is going to expand the world, they should also expand the villain controlling it. And speaking of expanding the world, I don't just want a bigger map. I want more reasons to care about the people living in it. And honestly, one of the best examples of this already exists. Majora's Mask. For all the praise Ocarina of Time gets, and deservedly so, I still think Majora's Mask has some of the best NPCs in the entire series. The people of Termina felt alive. They had schedules, relationships, problems, lives that continued whether Link was involved or not. Some of the most memorable stories in the game weren't about saving the world at all. They were about helping ordinary people navigate the last 3 days of their lives. Now, I'm not suggesting Nintendo turn Ocarina of Time into Majora's Mask. That would be a completely different game. But I would love to see some of that philosophy carried over. Imagine if Castletown felt more alive. Imagine if Kakariko Village had longer quest lines. Imagine if characters changed. and developed as the story progressed. Imagine if helping people actually felt like helping people instead of simply checking off another side quest. And while we're talking about Majora's Mask, there are a few characters I'd love to see expanded. The Happy Mask Salesman is an obvious choice. Even after all these years, he's still one of the most mysterious characters in the franchise. But honestly, Skull Kid is the character I'd be most interested in seeing expanded. Ocarina of Time introduces him as a lonely kid living in the Lost Woods. You can befriend him, play music with him, and then move on with the adventure. But knowing where his story eventually goes in Majora's Mask, there's a lot of potential there. Maybe we get a few more interactions. Maybe we learn a little more about him. Nothing that changes the story, but enough to make that connection stronger. And let's be honest, if Nintendo starts giving this kind of attention to characters like Skull Kid and the Happy Mask Salesman, people are immediately going to start asking the obvious question. Okay, but what about a Majora's Mask remake? And honestly, we've only scratched the surface. If Nintendo really wanted to expand Ocarina of Time, there are countless directions they could go. More time with sages before they awaken. Additional appearances from Sheik throughout the adventure. New side quests for Child Link. New races, settlements, and hidden corners of Hyrule to discover. Maybe even an entirely new dungeon or two built from ideas that never made it into the original game. The best larger remake wouldn't feel like a different game. It would feel like the Ocarina of Time many of us remember. The same adventure, just bigger, richer, and more complete. But even that isn't the most ambitious possibility. Because eventually, we arrive at the third option, the Grand Remake. Let's begin with our close fairy companion, Navi. I've always thought Nintendo left something on the table with her. Most people remember Navi as the fairy yelling,
Hey, listen!
And boy, was that jackhammered into their eardrums! But other than causing players to pull their hair out, she was originally planned to have more functionality. One of the more interesting ideas was the ability to fly around as Navi. I've always wondered what Nintendo could have done with that. And speaking of flying, Link has a lot of Peter Pan dancing around in his DNA. Green outfit, fairy companion, kid who doesn't want to grow up, and yet, somehow he never gets to fly. I'm not saying he should spend the entire game cruising around Hyrule like a superhero, but limited flight sections? I'm all for it. I'd also give Navi more to do, more abilities, more story relevance, more reasons to care when she eventually leaves. Maybe some of you never cared much about Navi. I always felt there was more Nintendo could have done with her. Another idea I've kicked around for years is making Ganondorf's conquest feel more real. Ocarina of Time tells us he conquered Hyrule with an iron fist. Most of it takes place off screen. I'd rather be a part of that conflict firsthand. Maybe we even get to play as Ganondorf for a short time. Villages under attack. Settlements being defended. Parts of Hyrule changing over time. Not enough to completely derail the story, just enough to make it feel like a kingdom at war. And if we're already talking about a larger conflict, why not show more perspectives? Now, don't panic. I'm not replacing Link. But there are huge chunks of this story where important things are happening and Link isn't around. Zelda becomes Sheik, Impa protects the kingdom, the sages fight their own battles. I've always wondered what some of those stories look like. A few playable sections could be an interesting way to explore them. Or maybe that's a terrible idea, and half the audience just threw something at their screen. Another idea I don't hear discussed very often is bringing back 2D gameplay sections. One thing I liked about Mario Odyssey was how it celebrated its history. Sometimes the game would suddenly shift into a classic 2D section, and it was cool. Why couldn't Zelda do something similar? Hidden caves, dream sequences, strange magical realms. For a few minutes, you're playing something closer to the original Zelda or A Link to the Past. I don't care if you think the green elf man is completely different from the jumping plumber. I just think it'd be cool. Speaking of things I'd expand, the ocarina itself could probably play a larger role. The game is literally called Ocarina of Time, yet after you've learned the required songs, that's basically it. I'd love to see a music creator, performances, minigames, NPCs reacting to different songs. Just more reasons to actually use the blue thing the game is named after. Then there's the Triforce. The Triforce is arguably the most important object in the entire stinking franchise. Everybody wants it. Everybody fights over it. And yet, as the player, we barely interact with it. If there's a good reason for that, I've never heard it. Personally, I'd like to see the Triforce play a larger role in both the story and gameplay. Not anything ridiculous, just enough to make it feel as important as the game keeps telling us it is. And honestly, we've only scratched the surface. Maybe the Lost Woods becomes a massive forest. Maybe the Temple of Time gets expanded. Maybe we spend more time with the sages. Maybe we learn about the Gerudo. Maybe we finally see what happened during those 7 missing years. Maybe the side activities get expanded. Better minigames. More competitions. A fishing system so deep that half the player base forgets Ganondorf is invading Hyrule. Once you start talking about a grand remake, the possibilities become nearly endless. And honestly, that's what makes this so much fun. Some of these ideas are probably great. Some of them are probably terrible. And a few of them are likely to get me assassinated by the Nintendo ninjas. But that's the fun of it. Once you start talking about an Ocarina of Time remake, it's almost impossible to stop. Before you know it, Link is flying through the sky. Ganondorf is invading villages. Navi has an entire skill tree. And somebody is spending 6 hours trying to catch a fish the size of a family SUV. At that point, you're not really discussing a remake anymore. You're just seeing how far down the rabbit hole you can go. And honestly, I think we've dug deep enough for one day. So until Nintendo finally tells us what they're actually doing, I'll be over here tuning my ocarina and waiting for Navi to stop yelling in my ear.
Hey, listen!
How about no?
Hi, Nino!